So moving on, we are moving to chapters 19 and 20. We're going to look at our quick breads and our yeast breads. So the objectives for this chapter, we're going to learn how to describe the differences and preparation techniques for various quick breads. We're going to look at the differences in pour batters, drop batters, and doughs. And we're going to look at the different preparation techniques for our yeast dough products and storage. So the early history, their history goes back at least 30,000 years in our history of bread. The first bread was probably made from a grain paste and water. If you want to think about it just as like a simple cracker, all right? And these were baked on hot stones. So the reason we call them quick breads is because we prepare them without rising or proofing, meaning as soon as we put our flour mixture together, we can just go ahead and cook it off. So some of the early quick breads that we've seen, we have lavash in Armenia, tortillas from Mexico, lefse from Scandinavia, chapati in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and we have our oat cakes from Scotland. All right. You don't have to memorize this. This is just a standard uh, chart on different proportions. We looked at our quick breads, we looked at our different batters and doughs. Batters and doughs go from a 1 to 4 ratio for our stiff doughs, 1 to 3, what is it, liquid to flour or liquid to dry ingredients. That's our soft dough. Our 1 to 2 is our drop batter, and then our 1 to 1 ratio is our pour batter. So we're looking at our different batters here, thin batter and pour batter. All right, so our thin batter is a 1 to 1 ratio. This we typically use it for our crepes, pancakes, waffles, popovers. Whereas our thick drop batter, all right, is a 2 to 1 ratio. We use it for our muffins, quick tea breads, coffee cakes, and dumplings. So the basic ingredients for our quick breads, we have our flour. Obviously, we can use wheat flour to develop the gluten. We can use different types of flours. We can use a combination of both. All right, so we can do potato flour or with wheat. We can do cornstarch and wheat, whatever you'd like. And then as far as liquid, most cases it will be water, but we can do different things like milk. We can use eggs, scrambled eggs, and so on. Salt is a key ingredient for enhancing the flavor, and then we want to use some sort of leavening agent. Again, we can do mechanical leavening, we can do chemical, or we can do natural, biological leavening. So that, sorry, not biological. Biological would not make it a quick bread. So we're looking at baking soda, baking powder, and different foams. So we can make foams from egg, or we can just incorporate air through creaming or just sifting our flour. Additional ingredients that we might see, we have our sugar, fat, and eggs. And getting a little bit fancier, we have nuts, fruits, and spices that we can add. So the common leavening agent, we have our baking powder and baking soda. All right, this is going to release some CO2 or carbon dioxide. Our liquid is going to be used to produce some steam. We get that from our milk, fruit juices, and eggs. And air we can incorporate through mixing, beating, and sifting. All right. Tenderizing or tenderizers that we use. Sugar is a good tenderizer because it steals liquid needed to create gluten. All right. It will give you smaller proteins. All right. Because it steals the water that will hydrate the smaller proteins like gluten and gliadin. Fat is called a shortening because it literally coats the gluten and gliadin, making the gluten and gliadin less available for the gluten formation. So it shortens the gluten strand. Oil contributes to our tenderness. All right, you're going to get something a little bit more dense. Whereas solid fat, which melts away after the cooking process happens, will give you tenderness and flakiness. So your your quick bread recipes, they're generally low in fat and sugar. Um, we want to make these less available. They're not available for tenderizing. So we have to use other techniques to prevent gluten formation, all right, or too much gluten formation. So how do we do this? Going back to our gluten formula, gluten and gliadin, manipulation and liquid, right? What we want to do is control the amount of mixing that we're using. So a lot of times, when you read directions for your muffin recipes, you'll have the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients mixed separately, and then combine the two. All right, after like you whip the wet ingredients and you mix the dry ingredients, you combine the two and just mix it maybe 5 or 6 times, all right, with your spatula to only moisten the dry ingredients. So the muffin method of mixing, this is when we sift our dry ingredients together, combine our moist ingredients in a separate bowl, make a well, and then you mix just enough to moisten the dry ingredients. All right, so this is going to eliminate lumps. It's going to prevent the overdevelopment of gluten, and it's going to prevent tough textures and tunnels. All right. So this is what we're looking at. When you're looking at something that's been overstirred, this over here, the muffin on the left, we made too much gluten with this one. You don't want to mix it too much because these tunnels over here, the gluten did form, and then the steam within the batter expanded to a point where you get these little bubbles on the inside. You want to prevent that. You also want to look at the shape of the muffin. Um, because it expanded so much, you do get this pointed top over here. You don't want this type of crumb, all right? What you're looking for, all right, optimal stirring, again, we're not mixing it that much. We're mixing it literally 4 or 5 times with our spatula. This is the type of product that we're going to get to over here. It's a nice even crumb. You don't have any holes over here. I mean, you have like 1 or 2 little ones over here, but it's nothing compared to the overstirred one. All right. Remember, the gluten is strong and it will hold onto and trap the gas, and you'll get this weird shape over here. So when you're making your muffins, all right, you want to make sure that you prepare your pans. First, you want to make sure that your oven is always preheated. You want to place your batter in the grease pan or a paper-lined muffin tin. You want to make sure that you're only filling it 2/3 of the way. Why? Because that moisture is going to boil, it's going to let off vapors, and this will rise. If you fill it up to the top, what's going to happen is everything's going to overflow and you're going to end up with a mess. All right, it's going to come out of the muffin tin. It's going to go onto the bottom of your stove, and it's not fun to clean up a hot stove. So you want to bake this at around 350 to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. To make sure it's done, just stick it with a toothpick or a knife, depending on what you have on hand. If it comes out clean and dry, you're good to go. So when you're looking for a good muffin, all right, the signs that you have a good quality muffin is that the outside is a golden brown. It is symmetrically rounded. Maybe will have a pebbled surface. Look at these guys over here. Slightly moist and medium size and uniform holes. Again, we're looking for something that doesn't have too many tunnels there. Our popovers or pour batters, all right, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. You might have done these in the lab portion of the class. What we did here was we heated up the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. We also put the tins in there. Why do we put the baking tins in there? To make sure that they're nice and hot, because we want to take advantage of that, like that initial burst of steam. These popovers are hollow on the inside. You want to make sure you get enough steam happening in the beginning. You want to cook You want to cook it enough so that it creates that crust on the outside, and then you drop the temperature to around 350 degrees so it cooks the rest of the way without burning, but it still maintains that shape. You'd like that height over here. These popovers, when they were filled about halfway. All right. So all of this on the inside, that's just a result of that first initial burst of steam. Your pancakes and waffles, they're going to be at there's also a pour batter, 2/3 of ratio of liquid and flour, a 2 to 3 ratio of liquid and flour. Um, so if you have 1 cup of liquid, it'll be 2/3 of a cup of flour here. All right, a little bit thicker. They spread nice, but they're not too thin that they're going to spread like water. All right. Your popover pan preparation, again, you make sure they're nice and hot so you can get that moist, hollow interior with that first initial burst of steam. And then you want to cook it over. The cream puffs, we made a pâte choux dough where we cooked the dough, we dehydrated the dough. We put a large amount of eggs in there so that we can get that emulsification happening. We also get that protein coagulation. They did come out steam leavened, all right, so a nice hollow inside. And we did the same thing as we did with the popovers. Cook them at a very high heat and for the initial 10 to 15 to 20 minutes. And then you drop it down so that you can hold on to that shape, but it still cooks all the way through without burning. When we're doing our cream puffs or our pâte choux dough, all right, the first thing we did was we melted down the butter in some hot water. We added the flour and stirred vigorously, all right, vigorously to create high gluten potential there. We want to make a lot of gluten there, but we want to avoid over evaporation of the liquid. All right, so we started with that. When you're seeing that skin or that the dough is cooking on the bottom of the pan, it's not burning. You're creating that skin. That's when you know you evaporated enough, all right, to get that pâte choux texture. You have a lot of gluten already created there. And then once you cool it a little bit, that same dough, you add the eggs one at a time, but you want to make sure you beat it thoroughly, all right? When you finish the dough should almost be like a consistency of mashed potatoes, all right? Thick, it's almost a drop batter, not quite a dough. You can't handle it, but it's not a poor recipe either. You want to make sure that you get the mashed potato consistency there. And again, bake it extra, extra hot at 425 degrees. Once it poofs up, all right, you get that height, you get that steam leavening action happening. You lower the temperature to cook it all the way through without burning it. All right. So this is what your cream puff should have looked like. All right, nice and high. They have an irregular crisp shell, golden brown, and it's got a moist, hollow center. So we can use these for our sweet or our savory recipes. Over here, they're using it as a savory recipe. They're putting a protein salad on the inside, so it can be tuna salad, egg salad, whatever you want to make. Or you can do what we did in class where we filled it with vanilla pudding. Super delicious. When we're looking at our doughs, all right, our doughs are going to be a little bit thicker, so they do contain more flour than our batters do. And these are typically needed, all right? We are able to handle them on like a flat surface. We can manipulate them, we can shape them, and so on. Biscuits and scones, they are typically higher in fat than our other quick breads, but you can make them less fatty, less rich if needed. So our doughs, we have our biscuits, scones, and our unleavened breads, such as matzo bread, our flatbreads, tortillas, and chapatis. All right. When we're doing our biscuits, all right, and this one is going to show up on your your practical exam for the lab class. All right. So what we're seeing here, this is our pastry mixture over here. This is what this tool is called. This is what we're going to use to cut solid fat into our flour until it resembles cornmeal. Why do we use this? It's got the blades there. We can cut the fat. A lot of times, what I do recommend to students is to take a stick of butter and cut it into small pieces, throw it into the flour. And then what we want to do here with this, cut it up into smaller pieces, but we're not using our hands. Our hands are about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's going to happen if we go in there with our hands? We're going to melt the flour and we're going to get a different texture altogether. We want to use this pastry blender over here so that we can get something that's quite flaky. All right. So we're keeping it cold. All right. You want to add your milk and stir briefly and use less liquid than your muffin, which allows for better handling. The dough should be a little bit sticky. These are going to be what we use for our drop biscuits or our rolled out biscuits. All right. Remember, we want to keep it nice and cold because if it liquefies or we melt the fat with our 100-degree Fahrenheit hands, we're going to get something that's tender but not flaky. We want to hold on to those flakes there. Our rolled biscuits, all right, you don't want to manipulate it too much. If you do, you will create extra gluten, which is going to make them a little bit tough. If you roll out your dough and you have a lot of extra dough left over, what you want to do is let the dough relax before rolling it out again. Why do you let it relax? It starts, that gluten starts to soften. So the next batch with the same dough that's rolled a second time doesn't get as tough. So let it relax, let it break down. You don't want to manipulate it too much. You can leave it on the counter. You can put it back in the refrigerator for 10 minutes, whatever you need to do. You just want to make sure it doesn't come out super, super tough because it will. This is what your drop batters will look like. All right. It's not, you can't roll it out like a dough over here. This is your 1 to 2 ratio, 1 cup liquid, 2 cups flour. Um, you can't pour this, you can't roll it out, so you just drop it down and it comes out very irregular shaped. All right. The dropped biscuits over here, this is what you're going to be making for your practical. All right. If you go into the practical and you end up with something like this, you added too much flour. You want it to come out like this over here on the bottom. All right. So the characteristics of a good biscuit. All right. We have our rolled biscuit over here. We have our drop biscuit over here. You want to make sure that you have a golden brown or crisp surface. You want to look for a tender, flaky texture, pleasant flavor. Obviously, do not forget the salt. If you forget the salt, it is quite obvious after we do our taste test. Our rolled biscuits, you want to have a symmetrical, straight shape. All right. Look at the shape over here. Look at the way it's cut, and you can see the layers broken down over here. You can see the flakes over here. Your drop biscuit, you don't want to have something that's completely round. You want to have that poorly defined shape. You want to have something that is kind of pebbly. All right, that's the perfect shape for it. That's the way it's supposed to look. These are going to be more tender than they are flaky. All right. Your scones, almost like a muffin, but a little bit less liquid there, so they're not going to be as fluffy. You can roll these out. So when you're looking at your different problems, all right, we'll see over here, a lot of the causes of the problems that we're looking at is because of excessive mixing. You don't have to remember this. You don't have to memorize this chart over here, but know that most of the problems that we see, whether the peak top, smooth crust, if it's pale, all has to do with excessive mixing. All right. So our yeast breads. Okay, yeast. You guys did use to make your pizza. You made the pizza, you made your Pullman loaf. What else did you guys make? Hot cross buns. All right, yeast has been used for over 5,000 years. Whether they knew that it was because it was the yeast itself that was adding to leavening, or if it was just bacteria that were generally available. Because of the aeration, because there were no windows, there was just yeast everywhere. Yeast, you can find it on your skin, you can find it in your mouth, but there's yeast all over the place, several different varieties. So in the 1860s, we finally were able to isolate the yeast and figure out how to use it in commercial kitchens and home kitchens. It was identified as a living organism. We do use it for alcohol fermentation and for dough leavening. In the 1900s, it was made available for commercial production, all right, for different bakers all over the world. So yeast, again, it's your microscopic one-celled plant. All right. It's a Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is the variety that we used for baking. All right. So it does produce CO2 or carbon dioxide and alcohol. All right. Alcohol is typically produced when there's no oxygen available. And the optimal fermentation time, fermentation temperature is from 81 degrees to 100 degrees. Anything hotter than that or around 130 will kill it. If it's too hot for you, it's too hot for the yeast. Just you want to remember that. So we have lean doughs and rich doughs. Lean dough, it only contains your basic ingredients. So flour, water, yeast, salt, and sugar. All right. So we have our Italian bread, our sourdough bread. Rich dough, it's any other additional ingredients. So eggs, milk, fat, and so on. All right. So we have our dessert coffee ring that we made. We also have the hot cross buns and our wheat biscuits. We're looking at the yeast again. All right. Yeast again. We have our compressed or our cake yeast. This you want to keep in the refrigerator. It does contain a little bit of cornstarch. And why is the cornstarch there? We're using it for um, a food source for the yeast. Our active dry yeast, this will give you about a quarter ounce or 2¼ teaspoons of yeast per packet. That is pretty standard across the board. And then we have our instant quick rising yeast. This is a very rapid rehydration, good for your bread machines. So we're looking at the starters again. So we have a sponge starter. You guys made these when you were starting your yeast breads. Basically, when you were asked to put your yeast in a bowl with warm water, that sponge or that foam that you guys created, that's called your sponge. All right, so that's the starter that we use here. We can also feed it with a little bit of sugar, sorry, a little bit of flour and keep it going for a long time. This starter, all right, we take out 2 tablespoons of mixture per day and we replace it with fresh flour. It naturally has yeast bacteria or yeast cells in there. All right, you just keep on feeding it, you get a more tangy, sour taste. Hence our sourdough breads that you see in San Diego. When we're talking about straight doughs, that means everything is added to the bowl at the same time. Everything goes straight into the bowl, if you will. So first you want to soften the yeast in warm water. You add your liquid, your sugar, your salt, and fat. You can add scalded milk. I believe we did use this for our hot cross buns. All right. Remember, scalding does denature the enzymes that would kill the yeast. All right. So we're looking at bringing it to a high temperature very briefly, and then we add our flour to it. The sponge method, all right, where what you all did for the other recipes apart from the sourdough recipe is what we softened the yeast in warm liquid, we rehydrated, we fed it a little bit, gave it some sugar and some flour. So what we did here, we made sure this isn't 100% necessary. What we're doing here is just making sure that the yeast is still alive. All right, so this is saving us a little bit of a headache. As long as you're getting some bubbles, then you know that the yeast is there. You add your flour, you add a little bit of salt, and then you can send it off to proof. Before we send it off to proof, you want to make sure that everything is mixed efficiently. All right. So we're needing to develop the strong elastic gluten. All right. We know that we're finished the kneading process when you take your dough. All right. You stick your finger in it. If the dough springs back to you, all right, you know that it's done kneading. All right. You created enough gluten, you're good to go. You can also tell if you're getting any blisters under the surface. Typically, you'll see this more when you're doing mixing through like a machine. Doing this by hand, when you're kneading by hand, you're not going to see as many blisters underneath the skin because, or underneath the surface, because as you guys know from kneading dough in class, it is labor intensive. All right. So during kneading, you want to make sure you're managing the amount of flour being used. You don't want to add too much flour because you're going to dry out your dough. You're going to get something that's very tough, very thick. You want to make sure it stays soft but not sticky. If it's sticking to your hands, you can add some extra flour, but again, you want to make sure you're not adding too much flour. Proofing or fermentation. All right, we're letting the yeast do its thing. So the optimal temperature for fermentation is 81 to 100 degrees. In class, we only proofed once. Typically, you would do this 2 times, but we just didn't have enough time in class. We still got a really good product there. For the first rising, you want to make sure that the that you grease your bowl, all right, so that it doesn't stick to it as it's doubling in size. When you know that it's finished, when it does double in size and when you stick your finger in it, if the fingerprint stays in the dough, that's proof that you finished proofing. All right. So you don't want to do it for too long. If you do it for too long, you're going to end up with a coarse grain and very thick cell walls. All right. And then when you're cooking it, the browning does happen unevenly. After you're finished proofing, all right, what you want to do is punch down the dough. All right, this expels the gas, it relaxes the gluten, and it equalizes the temperature of the dough. While it's proofing, you do have a lot of chemical reactions in there, so it does get a little bit warmer. So you want to make sure the temperature is even all around. After you finish punching it down, you can reshape it or you can make up and pan. So what you're doing is to shape the final, shaping the dough into the final product and placing it in the pan. All right, that's just making up and panning it, putting it into the shape that you need and setting it up. And then we typically would do a final proofing stage. All right, so after you shape or make up and pan your bread or your dough, what you want to do is proof it a second time. Because we had limited amount of time in class, we didn't do this, but it does make for a tastier, more tender product. So what happens when we're baking off our yeast doughs? All right, you get changes, different changes in appearance. All right, it gets a little bit higher. We have the texture or the crumb starts to form. We get a different flavor, and of course, the alcohol that was created by the yeast does get cooked off. We also use baking to kill the yeast. All right. If we didn't kill the yeast, all right, it would continue to ferment. All right. It is a live bacteria. Sorry, a live single-celled organism. Um, I will show you some videos when we get back into class of people that have thrown yeast into the dumpster behind the restaurant, and it just continues to grow because it's got a warm temperature, optimal conditions for it to continue to grow. It will overtake the dumpster if you let it. So this is why we kill it with a little bit of salt, a little bit of heat. During baking, our protein coagulates, so it goes from a liquid to a semi-solid form. We have our starch. It starts picking up the water. It's absorbing the water. It's holding on to it. It swells and gelatinizes. And then, of course, our fat melts. All right. And when all this is happening, our crumb does develop. So we have what's called oven spring. Oven spring is just the sharp rising of the dough during the first few minutes of baking. If we think of what happened with our cream puffs or just any of the bread products that we made, as soon as it goes from room temperature to 400 degrees, we get we get the action from the double acting baking powder or the yeast or our liquid starting to vaporize. So it does bounce up, it poofs up very quickly once it goes into the oven. How do you know when your bread is complete? You can take it out. All right. If it's something that you're cooking just on a regular sheet, you can take it off and tap it from the bottom. When tapped on the bottom, if it sounds hollow on the inside, you're good to go. And then you want to make sure that you cool it outside of the pan on a rack. Remember, we're taking it from 375 degrees to room temperature. Those proteins are going to try to go back to its original shape. The starch is going to start letting go of water. You want to make sure that any water released that's not going to be sitting stationary on the bottom of your loaf. All right. If that happens, what you're going to end up with all of that moisture that's coming out, it's going to leave you with a soggy bottom, basically. So when we're looking at our yeast spreads, what we have over here, we have our crumb. We have a nice fine texture, all right, with thin cell walls. It's a uniform grain. We're looking at the rounded top, all right. There's no like jagged edges. If you're rolling out the dough and you have some sort of seam, you always want to put the seam on the bottom. If it's on the side, it will open up and it's going to prevent you from getting this nice shred. All right, the shred over here, it's the area just above the pan. It's smooth, it's even, it's unbroken. You don't have any signs of a seam opening up over here. The seam, always keep it on the bottom. So we have different types of loaves. All right. We've got our, oy, loaf breads. All right. We have rolls, pita breads. We've got, what do we have here? Our knot breads, garlic knots, English muffin, pizza crust, and so on. All right. I want to keep on going through these. Staling. All right. We spoke about syneresis. We also spoke about retrogradation and weeping. All right. This happens when you take your cooked breads or cooked wheat product, all right, flour product. You take it from 375 to room temperature, it starts letting go of water. All right. So very, it gets very crumbly. All right. You get a leathery crust. The flavor tends to diminish a little bit, loss of moisture, very dry, and you get crumbs everywhere. This does occur more rapidly if you're refrigerating your bread. Once you have bread that's already been baked off and properly cooked, what you want to do is let it come back to room temperature and put it in the freezer. If you put it in the refrigerator, you do get the retrogradation process happening a lot quicker because a lot of times bread is typically stored in some sort of plastic or some container where there's not a lot of air movement. All right, so put it in the freezer if you want to hold it a lot longer. If you're purchasing bread during the warmer months or the summer months, you want to make sure that you put it in the freezer because room temperature is a lot hotter during those warmer months. So storage, you want to store it at room temperature if cold outside, or you want to freeze it. As far as temporarily reversing the effects of staling, you can take a piece of bread, put it into the oven to loosen it back up again. Or another thing that you can do is microwave it with next to, not on, next to a moist paper towel. All right. And your crusty breads, if you keep them in plastic bags, because of that water exchange going back and forth, you can maintain a little bit of that moisture. So we do have some YouTube videos for you. All right. If you want to go onto the slides and just check them out. There's a lot of videos. Um, in the quick breads and yeast breads chapters that you guys can refer back to. All right. So we're gonna close this one out, and then we'll get into our baking slides next.